Hi, this is John Firth, and you're here with the 10th broadcast of this season, i.e., the winter spring season of Firth and Friends. And I'm here with my very good friend, Jonathan and Alan. And as you might have known by reading the email blast, Jonathan Phillips has been an external recruiter, usually at the senior executive level and CEO level. And Alan has been head of HR, but he started out as a recruiter. So these are two gentlemen who know the ins and outs from all sorts of different angles of how to help people, how to help themselves through those periods when your career just sort of stalls and you're not entirely sure why. There are three areas that I like to break this down into. There's the external factors, so things that you don't have a lot of control over, the economy, government regulation, going to war and so forth, which inevitably will have an effect on many, many people's careers, and where you may find yourself without a job and no option of finding a job. That I remember very clearly from 2008 and also 2001. And then there's the friends and family issue. Your mother is sick and you have to take care of her. You got an unexpected divorce. There are children who are failing at school that will distract you. And that inevitably leads to issues with your career, despite all the talk about work and life balance. And then there's the internal factors, your mindset, how you think about things. You'll hear some also issues with how you set expectations for yourself, how well you know yourself, and so forth. So we're going to be touching all three areas. I want to use this chance also to let you know that Alan and John and I have started a group for people over, 55 is the number we came up with, over the age of 55, where inevitably the career starts going in weird places if it goes anywhere. And this is probably the hardest switch anybody has to make, because it's possible your career as you knew it had ended. So I wanted to make an announcement. We will be slowly inviting people to join this group. I don't know if you'll be on the list, but in the next couple of weeks, we will be recruiting for a kickoff date sometime end of April. So with that, I want to hand it over to Jonathan and to Alan, and I'll start with the first area, which is identify the root cause. So you have a career that's stalling, you know it, you see the signs, you feel it, but then you have to figure out why. And often this is very much a case of la nuda veritas, holding the mirror up, looking at yourself and going, what the F asterisk K have I done? So Jonathan, why don't you tell us from your point of view with the people you've worked with, some of whom have gotten stuck in their careers, and you help them with counseling and also finding a new job often.
Sure. Well, John, first, thanks for having me. Happy to join and hope what we do here helps as many people as possible. These topics are great. I think I run into two tranches of people where the root cause becomes critical. I often talk to people somewhere between years 10 and 20 when they suddenly realize they're not so happy with what they're doing. I talked to a second tranche of people who had sort of years 25 plus realized that they've been doing a great job all their lives, but for some reason they're unsatisfied. And often it's something as simple as, all these years I've done a great job helping my family, raise my family, help my company build a lot of business. I've helped my company's clients be enormously successful. Why am I not happy? And the simple answer is because they never thought about what they fundamentally want to do themselves. And it's a natural point in the evolution of a career. But that root cause, it's often somewhere inside a Venn diagram of helping others, helping their family, and helping their own companies. And somewhere in that, they've gotten left out, and I help them figure that out.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because as a service provider, and we're all three service providers, professional service or business service providers, is you often also forget about yourself because you're so focused on your clients and delivering value. You come second or sometimes even third. Yeah. And that's, a recipe for burnout. What about you, Alan? From an internal perspective, you've worked with senior executives when they're, first of all, you've been through some restructurings where people lose their job. What do you see as some of the root causes?
I think, some of the root causes that I've seen in my past have been people not planned for change in their life. And when they're forced into change, it really spins them out of control. I know for myself, when I was laid off from my last job, a couple of things going on. Number one, I was in recovery from cancer, so I had that against me. And number two, suddenly we were going into COVID and the company was basically shutting down, but they were going to lay me off as a VP. And so I was being thrown into this world of, oh my God, what am I going to do with myself? I got to get better. I have to deal with this layoff. And now I'm going to go home and I'm going to sit quietly in my townhouse with my dog and go, uh-oh, what is next? So I know for me, those were some root causes. And I know other people that I've chatted with, I think, you get to a certain age and you think you're at that, it's like the hockey puck, like you're going to hit that last shot and you're going to get that last goal. And suddenly somebody else hits the puck before you.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, we are at the behest of a lot of external factors. But in my case, I had two sort of major career stagnations. One is when I when I quit a job running a trade association and suddenly found myself independent, which I had always assumed would happen. I was I thought I was prepared, but I wasn't prepared. I went into coaching, obviously, after having been a consultant for 20 years or so, and I didn't realize just how different it was. And that can stagnate too, is when you take on something, a challenge, and you suddenly discover it isn't what you thought it was going to be. A little bit like what Jonathan said. Let's go to the next one. So you've done some root cause analysis, and hopefully you've come up with some smart reasons and understand yourself a little better. But then you got to actually reevaluate the career goals. So let's start with you, Alan. Tell us a little bit about maybe how you did that, but what you've seen in your role as head of HR.
So we talked about this earlier. So I knew coming out of being laid off that I no longer wanted to be a VP of HR. I knew I would do it to make money and pay my bills and make my mortgage. But if there was some other way I could, make change in my life, I was going to do that. And so I did decide to start my own consulting business and move forward. But that took a lot of time where I spent a lot of quiet time by myself thinking about what I wanted and kind of remembering like what it was like when I was 20, thinking about all these grandiose things that I wanted in my life. And now I'm in my 60s and a lot of grandiose things happened, but I wanted the wheel to keep spinning and I had to get it spinning all by myself. There wasn't anybody else to do it. And so it's been, I'm not going to say it's been an easy road, but it's been, I've met some incredible people and we're going to talk about that. But it was really more that inner telling the truth. Like, this is really what I want. It's like people who are a banker and now suddenly they've decided they want to dance for the New York City Ballet. But they go and they start taking classes and suddenly somebody realizes that they're pretty good. So it's, I think you really have to, you do have to be serious about it, but you do also have to dream about it too.
Yeah, it's. I think the honesty, it's very similar to what I went through at the age of 53, 54, which was realizing that I did not want to be a consultant again. I did not want to be head of a trade association, and I didn't want to work for a company. So I came up with, you're going to stay as independent as long as possible without bankrupting yourself. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. So I reevaluated career goal. I actually set a mission statement, if you will, or vision, and it's worked. I'm single, or no, not single. I'm married to my husband, but he makes money, I make money, so the financial thing sort of has worked itself out. So we haven't gone bankrupt. But Jonathan, what about your side? When you were helping people reevaluate their career goals, what are some of the things you do to help them figure that out?
Well, it's largely derived from the transition I went through. So I spent 10 years at Shell and loved every minute. And at one point I was evaluating, do we build or exit a particular business? And as I went through that, I built sort of a quick mission, vision, value statement for the business. And I looked at competitors and what was going on. And I asked myself the question at the whiteboard, what's Shell's objective in being in this business? And a light went off. Because I turned around looked at myself, and I happened to be in a glass room, and there I was turned around and looking in the glass, and there I'm looking at myself and saying, what am I doing here? Do I really want to be here? Anyway, I finished my job, went home and did a mission, vision, values for myself and said, what do I want to do long term? What are my real long-term fundamental goals? What am I passionate about doing or not? And what am I willing to not do? And it's what I didn't want to do that was the most clarifying. I had to be honest. There were some things I was not willing to do.
Yep.
Once I faced that, I went back, talked to a couple of people I trusted, validated this, and took my time, find the right thing, and ultimately transitioned out of Shell. And when I help people now, I go through the same thing. Before you do anything, don't do that. Before you do anything, let's talk about where you're going and what you want to do. And then I just help empower them to achieve their goals.
Excellent. So we have a question from Nora Lee. After restarting a career, do you have fears of failing? The answer is yes.
Every day.
In fact, every single day. That's an interesting question.
It's a great question.
Yeah, that's an awesome question.
That's a human question.
Yeah, it's an existential.
Yeah.
But it's a valuable question. And we've gone through some training where people take that fear response and they retrain it. I can't tell you how important it is. When I left Shell, I think the one thing I did right away was I started exercising and taking vitamins, because you wake up and it's stressful because you're kind of doing your own thing, but you can turn that negative into a positive. You can take that fear and use it to your advantage by clarifying what it is you need to do to reduce it. And it quickly crystallizes the tactical things you need to get done each day of every week.
Right.
It also, by the way, helps with fear to have someone else to talk to. Nothing reduces fear faster than talking to the person next to you about it. So.
No. What about you, Alan?
It's I had what I call my fear coaches that I would go to on a daily basis, and I have very close friends that I will talk with intimately about where I'm standing in my life and what my fears are, and they're very good about pushing back things. And what are you going to do about it? What's your plan? And that was the thing that I really had to stay focused on, is what was my plan. And it had to be certain things. Health had to come first. Then I could work on, delivering revenue for myself. And, and then third, it was like, staying in touch with my family, because we were in COVID, and, making sure that, because they're overseas, and, 4:00 every day, my sister and I used to FaceTime, and how, but it just had lifted my spirits. So I found things that would, keep me positive about what I was doing in my life.
Yeah. And I was going to say, speaking of that, there's a course that all three of us have taken called Positive Intelligence. And when I took it, it was like a thunderbolt, which was how much my fears, not just fear of failure, but particularly fear of failure, was causing me to do things that were sabotaging myself. That, for example, I would run away from something that I didn't think I was going to be good at. Instead of saying, well, maybe I shouldn't have taken that career path anyhow, or done that, or taking on a challenge. Now, taking on a challenge is actually, I've just recently discovered, one of the root saboteurs. Because when you take on a challenge, it often means you haven't really thought through what you're going to do. And that then can cause tons of fears, because the danger of failing when you take on a challenge is so high, as opposed to just continuing what you're doing. But there's always fear, always fear.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next topic. You have to develop new skills in many cases. I already talked about my example from going to consultant to coach, and I had new skills, a lot of them having to do with listening instead of talking. What about you, Jonathan? How would you say that?
I think it's really important. Again, once you know where you're going to go and you can figure out what do you need to be really good at to be successful. I often tell people, before you jump into developing a brand new skill, look at transforming the skills you already have. So go back and say, what am I really, really good at? And seeing how you transform those to the new environment. But then honestly, just as a point of refreshment, picking something new to develop, a new skill, a new area, a thing that you'd like to become eminent in, whether it's a skill or it's just a learning of a market segment, can be very refreshing, and it can give you a real new vision. It introduces you to new people, new ideas, and new topics. And even as you're transforming some previous skills, it can color how that transformation happens in very productive ways.
Yeah. And that comes back to what I said about a challenge. When you take on a challenge, you inevitably have to develop new skill sets. And there are moments when it's clear to you you're not as good at something that you thought you were, or you may not even know how to do it. And then you really do have to go out there and figure out what that skill set is and where you're going to get it. But we're going to talk about that in more detail in a second.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Alan? Skills.
Yeah, I think I really had to learn how to shift from being that 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 employee to being a consultant, which was kind of in a way 24 hours a day, because
very unstructured.
I was no longer like could tell somebody, well, here's what works for my schedule. I was saying, what works for your schedule? And the biggest lesson that I was learning was that I needed to ask people to help me, and ask people to introduce me to people. And that was a huge breakthrough, but people are always willing, listen, you ask 100 people and 10 will help you. Or 5 will help you, but it will get you somewhere into the next step. And, and then I landed that first contract, which was really a great contract.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there was a lot of different things that I had to shift just in how I ran my calendar, how I ran my communications, how I was branding myself, like, did I look like a consultant or did I look like a dweeb? It was like,
or the opposite. I look like a consultant when I was supposed to look more like an entrepreneur. Hence the polo shirt, which I never would have worn as a consultant. Yeah.
So there's another question there, John.
Yeah, there's a question, but I want us to take off from what you just said.
Okay.
So you've mentioned the next one, which is networking and rebuilding or building relationships. Now we'll go to that in a second. Let's see what the question is. As coaches yourselves, do you see coaching yourself? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Why is that, Jonathan?
Because you don't want, honestly, to avoid boredom. I think I'm pretty good at what I do. I like being good at what I do. I'm a huge proponent of don't assume that you know what you're doing. And so I will logic check my coaching format with other very professional coaches. I'll logic check the search work I do by affiliating with other senior search people. And I'll go to my clients and say, what am I doing well and what am I not doing well, just to make sure I'm refreshed. I just enjoy that part of refreshing my own skill set.
Yeah, I feel like I'm coaching myself all the time because I never know who I might be talking to and what that opportunity is in front of me.
Yeah. On my side, I am what we call a chair at Vistage, which is a business that helps people like myself form groups of CEOs and business owners to work with, and we get coaching all the time. So that's very formal. I would never have been able to make the transition to a coach without them. I didn't want to do a certificate program, but and then there are the informal coaches. There's a couple of you guys. We have this group. It's time for me again to mention we have a group of over 55-year-old, usually executives who are still executives or are transitioning into something else. And you guys have been great for helping me reflect things back that I'm trying to figure out.
I think I'm sorry, I want to jump in again. There's a more subtle and respectful learning that comes from that. It's a very, very good question. So even though I've written a book on how to do this stuff, when I talk to my clients that I'm helping, that I'm coaching, I will listen carefully to what they say. And I have a book full of edits that have come from the people I'm working with.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I often joke that I've learned more when I coach one of my clients or members of my group than I do talking to someone. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Anyway, so Alan, you started talking about the whole networking and relationships and so forth. So tell us from your point of view, how does this go? How do you go about doing this? what forces you to do this if you can't do it. I've got some clients who find it very hard to get back into the world and do this network and find relationships.
Fortunately, being an HR person, we're very talkative anyways. So that helped a lot. And I just decided to start. LinkedIn was huge for me. I just decided to start looking at all of my very large group of connections, and I started to reconnect with people, and connect with people, because I would look and say, okay, well, who does this person know that I might need to know? And I was working it every day for hours and making connections with people. And I think you have to go to social events. I was going to HR events. I had joined some HR groups. I was getting to know other HR professionals here in Denver. And it was, that was really helpful for me, because I would listen to them, and learn a lot about what they were doing and how they had gotten there, and realizing that I wasn't alone. And so working with those networks really helped a lot, because they will help you with referrals, but they'll also help keep your self-esteem up and moving, and that's a real critical thing.
Yeah, it's a source of opportunities, it's a source of support, and without that, it's very easy to crumble. I mean, this was basically the problem with COVID. It's suddenly all that stopped. I don't think people have gotten really comfortable yet with Zoom. Now, Zoom and things like this and my group, so much I do just sitting here, that in some ways it's become easier, but it's also some ways not as productive as when you're showing up face to face. But what I've discovered is it's amazing what Zoom and other platforms have enabled us in terms of being able to build relationships. There are people like you, Alan, we've never met face to face, that I've developed very good relationships with, both personally and business-wise. But Jonathan, what about your clients? And how do you get them to network and rebuild relationships if suddenly that's not is a zone of not comfort, of uncomfortableness?
Yeah, people are not sure how, especially if they're in transition. Their tendency is to call people and talk about needing to find another job, which is sort of the first thing I tell them, please don't do. But then I spend a little bit of time telling them, if 5,000 people on LinkedIn as connections, those are great. But what you really want for your career are advocates. So I will encourage them to say, pick 50 of the most senior people and let's send an email to them about an issue that they'd be interested in and see how they engage. Those that call back pretty quickly, they might be advocates. And then you'd follow up with them to talk maybe about some career transition issues. But I think Alan said something very telling. You could make 100 calls and get 10% response.
If you're lucky.
I think a lot of people, when they look at how many people they know on LinkedIn and they think, well, I'm going to transition, I'll reach out to them. I think they're often surprised at how few of them actually respond back in a way that's productive for their careers. So you have to revision your network. You have contacts, you have advocates that might help, and then you have even a fewer number of advisors that can lend you sort of support around making decisions for your career. It takes a little while to revision that network. I also love what Alan said about going to meetings. Nothing is more invigorating for a career than to go to association meetings or trade shows or places where people are hanging out that you'd like to work with, and just networking face to face.
Yeah. And again, during COVID, that changed how we do it. But I once in a career transition, after I left one of my jobs or was asked to leave due to a restructuring, I had a coach I'm not going to make advertisements, but Drake Beeman Moran, which was an outplacement firm. And she said something very telling to me. She was an older woman, lived in Connecticut. We got along really, really well. She said many things that helped me. But one thing she said is, it doesn't matter who you talk to, because you don't know who they know. She said, you wouldn't know this because even though we've gotten to know each other, you would not know this fact that I actually could call Wendy Murdoch if I had somebody I wanted her to talk to, because they had a compelling proposition for her. She said, so if you had something compelling and there was any reason you had to talk to her, I would make the introduction. And that was very simple. She had been a career coach at Yale. That's where Wendy Murdoch went, and Wendy Murdoch had been one of her coachees. And so I never would have guessed that. Now, I had nothing to say to Wendy Murdoch, so I never took her up on the offer. But again, you never know who somebody knows.
Right.
And so networking can become such a broad thing that should be. Really, everybody is a potential source of advice, opportunities, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So now, when you've done that, you're sort of starting to get some traction. You got to start taking calculated risks.
Yeah.
And Jonathan's laughing, so I'll have him go first.
So again, just in terms of a coaching paradigm, it's a little different when I do search, how I help candidates evaluate risk. But if you're looking to transition your career, what I do is give people tools to avoid false negatives and false positives. This is the biggest problem in the job market if you're in a transition. And a false positive is when somebody comes and tells you this great job they want you to do, and you get very excited because it's a perfect fit, or it appears to be. And then you show up, and what you discover is you don't really like the people. The company doesn't really have the resources, money, time, and people resources to support your success. And 2 years later or less, you're looking for the next thing. You know, a false negative is sometimes the regret, right? Somebody comes to you with something that doesn't make sense because maybe you don't want to move to that location. But in hindsight, it was perfect. Great leaders, great issues, tons of resources to succeed. And by the way, if you talk to your family, the location issue probably could have been managed. So what I do is I help people not calculate risk, but avoid false positives and false negatives so that the risk you take is more likely to have a positive outcome.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Alan?
No, I think the same thing. I mean, for me, taking the calculated risks were stepping into areas that I would never go before, and going places and meeting people, or trying to make contact with people I felt like were, big in the HR industry. Like, why would they ever talk to me?
Mm-hmm.
And and also talking with HR people who, were competitive and just didn't snub me.
Mm-hmm.
And all I was saying is, hey, I'm out here and I'm looking to consult, and, do you guys bring in consultants? And like, they would start rafting off all this wonderful stuff that they were doing at their company. And I would listen, but, I had to just keep going and hitting each person and keep talking to people until I found the right people. And Jonathan had made a point to me a long time ago about finding somebody in your life who, you can go to, who will be a coach, but a mentor, and somebody who will kind of kick you in the, what, when you need it. Because there's a lot of work to this. This isn't like start for a couple of hours and, hey, I think I'm going to take a coffee break, or, hey, it's time for, the view. I mean, this is like,
it's intense. It's one of the most intense activities I've ever seen.
And other people on the other end want to really hear that you're working hard at this, because then they want to help you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Now, we have a word in this phrase, take calculated risks. Does somebody want to opine on what it means to take calculated risks?
Yeah, you do. I'm going to jump in on that.
How do you find a calculated? How do you calculate a risk in this situation?
At some point, you have to quantify the process. And I get positives and negatives, but people I coach ultimately say it was probably the best quantitative exercise they went through. So jobs have 6 selection criteria, which we know, like location and functional, the obvious things you can look at in LinkedIn. Careers only have 3 selection criteria. And this is where the calculated risk becomes qualitative, but actually, in your gut. They are only working with people you like and respect, only taking a job where you're passionate about the issue it's addressing, and making sure if you take this job, that your family is going to be better off. And that last one is a very complicated discussion at first, but it's actually pretty easy to get at without the other person having to reveal too many personal things. I can tell them, how do you construct whether your family's better off? And there are ways to do that. And it ultimately has very little to do with money.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because in the cases where I have not a side business. Part of my business is working privately with former CEOs. And they've got to find their next job. Now we know that finding another CEO job is really, really hard. But I always start the engagements by asking them, what's your wife's attitude to the situation you're in? Is she okay with it because she has a job and so finances aren't a big issue? Is she not okay with it and it's going to push you? Because that inevitably tells me how this thing is going to go. I had one gentleman who I started coaching when he had a new job as CEO of a company. And he discovered very quickly there were a lot of problems with the company. And he started being very vocal. Well, after about 8 or 9 months, there was an agreement with the board that he should resign. And then he was without a job. He got a job within 3 months. Not only did he get a job, it was the perfect fit. And he was like a bat out of the cave. I mean, he just went after it. He told me later, now this is, I hope maybe he doesn't see this, but he said to me, had I not gotten this job, my wife would have committed suicide. Now, I never asked him if that was metaphorical, if she really would, but she obviously had put on so much pressure on him that he was just going out there pounding the pavement. And so, yeah, very often your wife or your husband will be the driving force or not driving force, depending on their attitude about what you should be doing, how much money do you need to make, and so forth. And I think people forget that.
I think John does bring up a good point. You do have stakeholders in this decision, and often when we talk about risk, the other party wants to see something. And you can take the 6 job criteria, the 3 career criteria, you can make a spreadsheet out of it. And one of them is compensation. Right. And you can show your significant other, here's how I'm evaluating my next opportunity. So they can actually see something.
So Nori asks, if you take that risk and it's not what you thought it would be, what's your exit plan? Well, first of all, I would say, is there an exit plan necessary? Do you have to have one? But Alan, maybe you have some thoughts about that. If you take the risk and it turns out not to work, is there an exit plan and what is it?
I mean, I think you go in not really thinking about an exit, that you need an exit plan. You're going in because somewhere the stars are bright and everything is shiny and it looks like it's the right thing. And then suddenly, and I recently had this happen with a consultant, with a client. And, once I entered, I was in an atmosphere of a place where, they're turning over 135% of their population. Oh, I mean, it was like being in a war zone. And I said, this isn't what I signed. It's not, look, I can do this, but am I going to be happy doing this? And I'm getting on airplanes. I said, no. And I just professionally backed out. I just said, sorry, but I don't think that this is a fit for me.
Right. And I think that's a perfect example of an exit plan, but you have to have the intestinal fortitude to be able to do that. And some people stick to it, and that will also cause a career breakdown eventually. Jonathan, any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I mean, either you or the people you work for are going to have an exit strategy. And what you want to do is create your own before the company you work for exercises theirs. Because at the end of the day, companies do what is in the best interest of their survival. And they generally don't do what's in the best interest of any particular individual in a company. So really, when you have a career, you own the question on that exit strategy. And if you have an advisor and you've done some planning and you've thought through your network and you know what you want to do with your career, it becomes much easier to pivot when something happens.
Yeah, I would say add to that also, I'm a great fan of plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, is you should already have in the back of your mind if you're going to exit what those plans are. But more importantly, if you can stand it and if you have the time to do everything you need to, I would not just up and exit a role without having anything in the works. It's very hard when you don't have a job to convince somebody to hire you. So I did that, but I did it and became a freelancer, independent. And it wasn't totally calculated, but in the end of the day, that was my plan B when I decided that I had finished with that role. So our last question, or our last topic, is prioritize work-life balance. Now, Alan, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this. Tell us a little bit about your experience with this, maybe some executives you work for, and then also in your own life.
Well, work-life balance for me was something that I spent 15 years at one company and I forgot that I was supposed to have a work-life balance. So, coming out of that, it's I used to observe other people who were, as I was driving along and they were on the golf course. I think, how the hell did it get there?
Yes, that's a great analogy.
Or they were on the tennis courts, and I'm like, there's something missing in my life. And, I had to, first off, I had to find out if there was anything I liked to do, because all I was doing was working. And, and it's like, I found that I loved working out, and that became I joined a gym, and I got, I hired a trainer. I made some major changes for myself, and suddenly I was in the gym about 4 days a week, if not 5, and I was blowing it out, and it was very good for my psyche.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Working out is key,
and it became a priority over other things that could wait. But there was I look at a lot of people who have no work-life balance at all still. Like, I see too many people that are running around and they're in desperation, and they're wanting work-life balance, but they're scared that if they take that and they try something, or take an afternoon or a few hours to go work out or do whatever, that somebody in their company is going to see it and say, oh, you're one less person we need.
Yeah. There's that fear. There's an unfounded fear.
So,
I have an interesting. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
I find some of the people who clients, whether or not they are, there's people transitioning. There's others who are running their own company, or what have you. Is there becomes an overcompensation for not having had a life, if you will, when they have to change, and then it becomes all about. I can imagine myself, I have somebody who's in this situation too. I could really imagine myself moving to Thailand. I have enough in the bank, it would be okay. And I just looked at her and I said, you will be so bored. I know you well enough to say. She said, yeah. So people suddenly default to more life and less work. And that's also dangerous, because sometimes you opt for more life and then you're bored. Or you see your friends still charging along and you feel like you've lost your peer group. So that's been my experience. There's this this reaction to having not prioritized life, to suddenly way over prioritizing life. But Jonathan, what is some of your experience?
Yeah, I agree with everything I'm hearing. And when I first think about work-life balance, I think I asked myself a fresh question: is there a better framework than work-life balance? And what I came up with was community of work. Because really, what you do at work and what you do with your life, they're not oppositional. They're not balanced as either or. There's more of a continuum. And so what I do is I tell people, look, sit back and ask yourself, what does your family want to do, right? What do you love to do personally with your own hobbies, separate from your family? And what do you need to do at work? What are you doing at work to balance this? And it's very similar to how I tell people to integrate. And I'll close the loop really quickly. So when you join a new company, you have to be both politically, intellectually, and socially integrated. Beyond the scope of this call is how that works. But that social integration, that ties to what you do with your family and your personal life. You want your community of work to be seamless. So if you're going to play tennis, if you're going to play golf, do it with coworkers, do it in association.
No.
Do it with the people you respect at the company where you love what you're doing, and have it blend together. It doesn't mean don't do your own thing. Like, I bike ride, but when I bike ride, I take pictures of where I'm bike riding and I share it with my clients and candidates that also love bike riding. So I think there's a balanced community of work that can be very fulfilling and sort of help you get out of the oppositional work-life balance trap.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I think of it this way. If you've got a dream job, if you've really knuckled down, gone through all the steps we just talked about, and you're back on track and probably doing better than before because you've been through a lot of self-evaluation, often that makes for a great work-life balance, because it doesn't feel like work anymore. And suddenly you're just feeling good about yourself and the world. And then it's natural that you embrace life the way you should, because your mind is in such a good place. Anyways, any other comments from you guys? This has been awesome. I think we really sort of tackled the subject. I'm hoping our listeners and our viewers take this to heart, because I think this has been actually one of my better.
I think it would be great if they would, write to us, and or our emails are up here, and ask more questions or give us their thoughts on what they would add to this, and if they also want to be part of the group that's being put together. I think that's I don't think people realize how hard John Firth works to make all of this come together. So it's well worth your while to look behind the Iron Curtain and find out.
Yes, the Iron Curtain. In my case, it's I don't know what that stuff is made of cotton maybe, or polyester. Bill, thank you for that. Yes, there is this group for the ultimate transitioners, which are those who are going into their third act. And that usually starts becoming an issue around the age of 55. Jonathan actually and I came to that decision. So I would love to hear from anybody who wants to explore being in that group. You see our emails, but also if you go to the LinkedIn invitation, you'll be able to click on all of our pictures or our little entries there, and you'll go to our profile. And then you'll be able to send us a message as well. So there are all sorts of ways of getting in touch with us. Jonathan, any parting comments from your side?
No, I get lots of similar questions to what we've heard today. I often, especially on work-life balance, sometimes people will say, when do you actually turn it off? I think I want to be careful how I respond, because that continuum does include a point at which I turn off my phone and just ride my bike. And it's important to get some alone time with yourself to kind of process things as well. And I think you just have to get that agreement. And I usually do that with my family. We'll just go somewhere, turn off our phones, and hang out together. So it's important.
And that's great. All three of us are independent. We don't work as part of an organization. We work for organizations. And one of the benefits is I have really learned to, first of all, my natural biorhythms. Now, I am an evening person, not a morning person. So you got a lot of work done in the evening, and when you're independent, there's a lot you can do in the evening. Whereas if you're in one of those 9 to 5 jobs, you got to show up at 9 and only work until 5. Well, I really get going at about 8 p.m. for about 3 or 4 hours. So I've been able to adapt my natural biorhythms much better, and that in itself already makes for a good work-life balance, because I'm actually working the way, whatever reason, my biorhythms work.
But I like that you're positioning the group, John, and I think it's helpful, and not just for people in transition, but people that just want to think more clearly about their careers, even before you're at the point where you need to transition. I'd love to have them come and just hear a few of these things so that they kind of understand what could happen in the future and get prepared for it.
Exactly. And I will be putting together a formal value proposition, and I'll start advertising this group. So we'll be able to subsume all these different issues. But of course, the biggest issue for me when I turned 55, and I think Alan and John, you sort of shared this as well, was the issue of relevance and financial security. My biggest issue is I want to stay relevant. I look at the grassy pasture and say, that's not for me. And really at the heart of everything is I want to stay relevant. I want to help people. I want to have impact. But I also have financial obligations. And as you get closer to retirement, or as you get older, that starts becoming very important, especially if you don't have the sort of savings you need.
Yeah, very true.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody who joined us. This is a video that you'll be able to find on LinkedIn. So if you're tuning in at the last minute, please take a look at it. And I want to thank Jonathan and Alan, and I look forward to talking to you again tonight at our weekly session as a group.
Great. Always here.
And John, appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
For joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.